December 8, 1944, somewhere in eastern France. Third Army headquarters was freezing, and not just from the temperature. General George Patton sat at his desk staring at weather reports that all said the same thing: rain, sleet, fog, the kind of weather that grounded planes, turned roads into mud, and gave the Germans exactly what they needed: time. His Third Army was supposed to be advancing, but you can't advance when you can't see 50 yards and your tanks are drowning in December slush. Patton slammed the report down and said something nobody expected. "Get me a chaplain. I need a prayer."
And now this ungodly weather. I want a prayer, a weather prayer.
His staff thought he was joking. He wasn't. What happened next would become one of the most controversial moments of the entire war, a prayer that seemed to change the weather, a battle that turned on divine intervention, and a priest who learned that when George Patton asks God for something, even the Almighty pays attention. The chaplain who got summoned was Colonel James O'Neill, Third Army's chaplain, a quiet man who'd been with Patton since North Africa and had learned that when the general called, you showed up fast. O'Neill walked into headquarters expecting orders about Christmas services or morale visits. Instead, Patton looked at him and said, "Chaplain, I want you to write me a prayer for good weather. I'm tired of these soldiers having to fight mud and floods as well as Germans. See if you can't get God to work on our side." O'Neill just stared. He'd been a priest for 20 years, had served in combat zones, had heard strange requests, but nobody had ever asked him to order weather from God like it was ammunition from supply. O'Neill tried explaining that prayer didn't work that way, that you asked for strength and guidance, not tactical advantages. Patton cut him off. "I don't care how it works, chaplain. I need good weather to kill Germans. If you can get it, I'll promote you. If you can't, I'll get a chaplain who will." O'Neill left the office with orders to write a prayer for weather and have it on Patton's desk by morning. He went back to his quarters, sat down and stared at blank paper for an hour, trying to figure out how you write a prayer that asks God to take sides in a war without sounding like you've lost your mind. What O'Neill didn't know was that Patton wasn't being casual or blasphemous. Patton genuinely believed God paid attention to soldiers, that divine intervention was real, and that asking for help wasn't different from asking for air support. Patton had been raised Episcopalian, read the Bible regularly, and believed that God favored the bold. He'd survived battles where he should have died, had watched shells land where he'd been standing seconds earlier, and had concluded that something was keeping him alive for a reason. If God had a plan, Patton figured he might as well ask for good weather to help execute it. O'Neill wrote the prayer that night, kept it simple, respectful. Started with, "Almighty and most merciful Father, we humbly beseech Thee, of Thy great goodness, to restrain these immoderate rains with which we have had to contend." Then asked for clear weather, so that, armed with Thy power, we may advance from victory to victory and crush the oppression and wickedness of our enemies. He ended with assurance that everything was for God's glory, not man's. It was careful, diplomatic, the kind of prayer that asked for help without demanding it. He brought it to Patton the next morning, December 9th. Patton read it once, looked up and said, "This is good. Print up 250,000 copies. I want every soldier in Third Army to have one by tomorrow." O'Neill thought he'd misheard. 250,000 copies of a prayer? Patton was serious, deadly serious. He wanted every soldier carrying that prayer in his pocket when they attacked. O'Neill tried pointing out that printing that many copies would take resources needed for actual military operations. Patton didn't care. "Chaplain, I don't care if you have to requisition every printing press in France. Get it done." The printing happened overnight. Third Army's printing facilities worked through December 9th, producing prayer cards, small enough to fit in a pocket, with the weather prayer on one side and a Christmas message on the other. By December 10th, 250,000 prayer cards were being distributed to every unit in Third Army. Soldiers who received them had mixed reactions. Some thought Patton had finally lost it. Others appreciated the gesture, even if they didn't believe prayer would change weather. A few devout soldiers knelt and prayed immediately. Most just stuck the card in their pockets and went back to preparing for whatever orders came next. December 10th, 1944. The weather was still terrible. Rain, fog, visibility near zero. Patton's staff looked at the forecast and saw more of the same for the next week. Then, December 11th arrived. The rain stopped. The fog started lifting. By afternoon, the clouds broke, and actual sunlight appeared for the first time in 2 weeks. Patton walked outside, looked at the sky, and said to nobody in particular, "Hot damn, it worked." By December 12th, the weather was clear. Cold, but clear. Perfect flying weather. Perfect tank weather. Everything Patton had asked for. Patton called O'Neill to his office, thanked him, told him that prayer had changed the weather, and now they were going to kill Germans with divine assistance. O'Neill didn't know how to respond because he was a priest, and priests aren't supposed to claim they can order weather from God, but he also couldn't deny what had happened. 2 days after 250,000 soldiers started carrying that prayer, the worst weather in decades suddenly cleared. Coincidence seemed unlikely. Divine intervention seemed impossible. But something had changed, and the timing was too perfect to ignore. Then December 16th happened. German forces launched a massive surprise offensive through the Ardennes forest, what would become known as the Battle of the Bulge. Panzer divisions smashed through American lines, created a bulge in Allied defenses 50 miles deep, and threatened to split the Allied armies. Eisenhower called Patton to headquarters and asked how fast Third Army could disengage from their current positions, turn 90 degrees north, and attack the German flank. The answer would determine whether the offensive could be stopped or whether it would reach the English Channel and divide Allied forces permanently. Patton said 48 hours.
I can attack with 3 divisions in 48 hours.
His staff thought he was insane. Turning an entire army 90 degrees in winter required logistics coordination that normally took 2 weeks. Patton didn't have 2 weeks. He had 2 days. And he had clear weather. That was the miracle O'Neill's prayer had delivered. Not just clear skies for a few days, but clear skies during the exact 72-hour window when Patton needed to move 133,000 and 62,000 vehicles north through frozen roads without air cover or resupply. December 19th, Third Army attacked. Units that had been fighting east suddenly turned north and hit German forces in the flank at Bastogne, where the 101st Airborne was surrounded and running out of ammunition. The attack succeeded because Patton's columns could move at full speed on frozen roads under clear skies with air support from planes that could finally fly. If the weather had stayed bad, the movement would have been impossible. The 101st would have been overrun. The German offensive might have succeeded. The battle lasted through December and into January, but the turning point was December 22nd, when Patton's forces broke through to Bastogne and relieved the siege. German forces were forced back, their offensive collapsed, and the Bulge was eliminated by January's end. Third Army had moved faster and fought harder than any army its size had ever moved or fought, and they'd done it during winter in terrain that should have been impassable. Patton credited the weather prayer. His soldiers, who'd carried those prayer cards through the entire battle, started believing it too. Colonel O'Neill became a legend. Soldiers called him the chaplain who ordered good weather. Some joked that he had God's personal phone number. Others treated him with genuine reverence because they'd seen weather change after he prayed, and they'd survived battles that clear skies made possible. O'Neill himself remained humble, insisting that he'd just written words Patton requested, and God had done whatever God chose to do. But privately, he admitted he couldn't explain what happened. The weather had cleared exactly when needed. The timing was impossible to dismiss as coincidence. After the war, historians and meteorologists studied the weather patterns from December 1944. The consensus was that a high-pressure system moved into the region on December 11th, clearing the persistent low-pressure system that had dominated for weeks. That's the scientific explanation. It explains how the weather changed, but not why it changed exactly 2 days after 250,000 soldiers started praying for it to change. Patton never cared about scientific explanations. He knew what he'd asked for, knew what he'd received, and knew that timing like that didn't happen by accident. Critics argued Patton was being superstitious, that weather patterns are natural phenomena not subject to prayer, that attributing military success to divine intervention was dangerous because it suggested God favored America over Germany. O'Neill heard these criticisms and responded carefully. He said prayer wasn't about commanding God, it was about asking for help and accepting whatever answer came. The fact that clear weather arrived when needed didn't mean God had picked sides. It meant God had answered a prayer in a way that happened to help Third Army. But Patton saw it differently. He believed God did take sides, that righteousness mattered, and that fighting to liberate Europe from Nazi occupation was righteous enough to warrant divine assistance. The prayer proved, in Patton's mind, that God was paying attention and approved of what Third Army was doing. That belief shaped how he commanded for the rest of the war, with confidence that bordered on fatalism because he believed he was operating under divine protection until God decided otherwise. The prayer cards became collector's items. Soldiers kept them for decades, showing them to grandchildren and explaining that this piece of paper changed the weather and saved their lives. Some cards ended up in museums, others stayed in wallets until the soldiers who carried them died. The prayer itself became part of military folklore, cited in sermons and leadership courses as an example of faith under pressure. Whether it actually changed the weather remained debated, but what wasn't debated was that it changed how Third Army fought, giving them confidence that something beyond themselves was working in their favor. George Patton died in December 1945, a car accident in Germany that killed him months after surviving 4 years of combat. Some saw irony in that, others saw divine timing. Patton had accomplished what he was meant to accomplish, and his protection ended when his purpose was fulfilled. Colonel O'Neill survived the war, served as a priest for decades, and never claimed to have miraculous powers. When people ask about the weather prayer, he'd say the same thing. I wrote what General Patton asked for. God did the rest. Don't ask me to explain it, because I can't. The lesson from the weather prayer isn't about whether divine intervention is real or whether prayer changes physical reality. The lesson is about leadership and belief. Patton believed prayer would work, so he ordered it done. His soldiers believed their general knew something they didn't, so they carried those prayers and fought with confidence that something was helping them. Whether that something was God or just collective psychological effect doesn't change the result. Third Army moved faster, fought harder, and succeeded in conditions that should have made success impossible. The priest who told Patton that God doesn't take sides in war learned something that December. Maybe God doesn't take sides, but when 250,000 soldiers ask for help and then fight with everything they have, outcomes can look a lot like divine intervention. Whether you call it faith, confidence, or coincidence, the weather cleared when Patton prayed for it to clear, and that was enough to change history. Subscribe if you haven't already, because we're covering the moments when faith and warfare intersected and outcomes defied explanation. Drop a comment telling us whether you think the weather prayer was divine intervention or lucky timing, because that question gets to the heart of whether belief matters more than evidence. The soldiers who carried those prayers through the Battle of the Bulge had their answer. They survived, and sometimes survival is the only proof you need.